Welcome back to Connect and Transform. We're continuing our work on a text comparison tool for the web. We're going to begin by performing one or two fixes and tweaks to the code as we left it in the last video. And then I'm going to pull up some pseudocode and discuss the general approach I have in mind for the project. And then we can revisit the Notepad++ compare plugin, and we'll compare and contrast that to our progress so far in our browser-based tool. And then we'll get into this file and continue building it out a little bit. So the first thing I want to point out is in this function build content, both of the mistakes from the last video are in this same line. The first mistake is that here I had .replace and the intention was .replace all. We want to replace all tab characters, tab arrows, by encapsulating them in a span tag. Secondly, for the content specifically, we had this .replace all, and we were replacing spaces with non-breaking spaces. This ended up being a bad idea because that makes the entire text file line be seen as a single word by CSS. And that does not behave well when you have overflow hidden and you shrink the browser window down to a thin width. So we're going to remove that. So in the end, we should just have content.replace all tabs by encapsulating them in span tags. So that's it for fixes from the previous video. I'll go ahead and save that file. So now switching over to pseudocode text file. We've already begun our text compare function. In fact, maybe I'll go back real quick and we'll scroll down just as a reminder. So we have this text compare function. It hides our file input elements. It creates our left and right tall subcontainers. It handles reading the actual content and splitting it out into objects. Initializes these iterators and pointers. And we have one while statement and then one condition inside that statement. And so looking here at our pseudocode, this while number one is the while statement that we've already produced. And this first condition here is the condition that we've already produced. So these are already done. And now we got to finish all this. So the basic idea is we're keeping the while loop that we've produced, we're keeping the condition that we've produced, and I think those are all appropriate. The only thing that might need to change is we might need to change the specific location of advancing pointers. But as far as program logic, to this point, I believe it's correct. So in addition to checking for whether two things are exactly equal as is, in fact, maybe I'll just put that in there so that it's very clear. We also need to look at trimming white space. So that would be removing white space at the beginning and ending of a line, at least using JavaScript as an example, but not removing white space inside of the content of a line. And so we would give this a class name, and I'm just saying maybe we could call it white space trim. Give it a generally blue color, make sure that it's very subdued, because if all we're doing is trimming the head and the tail white space, in all likelihood, the code itself would not be affected by that change. Now, just a reminder, this is not a code analysis tool. This is a text analysis tool. And the main purpose of it is to group lines together by these classifications, and maybe I'll think of a couple more classifications, but basically classifying lines, grouping lines, and then giving the user a UI to be able to move either a line or a block of lines from one side to the other. It's not necessarily intended to be a general purpose text editing tool, and I may never make it as such, but that is a possible extension of this tool in the future, is to make it more general purpose and have all the content be editable, which is, of course, a built-in feature of HTML5. So back to these various classes. So we have white space based on trim, and then we may also choose to do a comparison after removing all white space. So again, not a code comparison, but a text comparison. And so we would give that its own class name. Maybe we'd keep the blue coloring, but make sure that its level of being subdued, which we'll probably achieve through opacity of the background and maybe also opacity of the text. I will want that opacity to vary just a little bit, or possibly I'll want the color to vary a little bit. Moving forward, there's another condition here, if they're nearly equal. And so this is the one that is least well defined in my mind, but we might give it a class name of altered, make it stand out a lot more. And so one example of what we might look at here is we might just say, if the first n characters are equal, but the two lines are not equal, well, in particular, we might trim both sides. Or we might remove all white space and then just look at the remainder and say, well, if the first n characters are the same, but the lines are not the same themselves, then treat that as an altered line or something like that. It's the least settled in my mind. So then inside of our main while loop, if none of these are true, let me think about this. So it would only be if none of those are true. So I'm going to put in here else, and then maybe I'll tab this whole thing over. Otherwise, we're going to have another while loop. And the purpose of this while loop is to handle the look ahead pointers. And I thought about maybe doing 2 while loops, but I believe it has to be a single loop to allow interweaving of the left and the right having certain conditions occur. So maybe now I'll switch over to the other instance of Notepad++. So this is showing our 2 test files, the ones that we're feeding into our program. Let me scroll down a little bit. Okay, so like right here, for example, we have this red portion that only exists on the left. We have some examples of the green portions that only exist on the right. So if I were to have 2 separate while loops, I believe that what would happen is that all the green ones would have to be processed first, and you'd reach the end of the file, and then it wouldn't process the red ones properly. Now, I might be mistaken there, and it might be entirely possible to have one while loop here for the left look ahead pointer, and then as a sibling, after that first while loop is exhausted, have another while loop here for the right look ahead pointer. But the way that I'm thinking I'll implement it is with a single while loop. And we break when both of the look ahead pointers are exhausted, and that means when the look ahead pointer has reached the end of its associated file. So if lines only exist on the left, that would be an example of the red ones. I'll switch back over real quick. So that would be like these 3 lines here. So that's the condition that we're talking about. Something exists on the left, doesn't exist on the right. Then we're going to produce a line, and on the left-hand side, we'll give it class names of .left and .only. And the reason we're giving it 2 class names is that we'll also have .right and .only. And then we're also going to have .empty. And so we see here I've said, well, that'll be red, that'll be green, that'll be black, and we'll use some opacity to subdue these to various degrees. And then I also want to note it's important that if we get to the point where we find the match and we've reached the end of the group, and then we're producing our group, then we need to break out of the while loop, because the whole purpose of this while loop number 2 is the look ahead pointers, and the whole purpose of the look ahead pointers is to identify the boundaries of these various groups. And so once we've found something that matches, so like for example, let's take this for loop here, which matches this for loop here exactly. So for example, so let's say we're here at this closing brace, and I know this might be a little small, but the actual code is not important. Actually, let me just zoom that in a little bit. Okay, so let's say we're here on line 188, which by the way is not line 188 of either file. It's logical line 188 in the comparison. So when we're on line 188, our processing pointer and our look ahead pointers, all four of those pointers, are going to be equal to whatever the position of whatever the line number of the corresponding file is at that point. So the two left-hand pointers could be different values than the two right-hand pointers, but the left and the rights will be the same as each other at this point in the file. And so then we'll advance, right? And so the left-hand file advances to this content, and the right-hand file advances to this content. Obviously, they're different. And so this is where we enter while number 2. And by having both the left and the right combined, we can advance the look-ahead pointers on both sides, and then we'll be comparing these selected values, which are equal to the processing pointers values. We'll be comparing like the left processing to the right look-ahead, and at the same time, we'll be comparing the right processing to the left look-ahead. So the look-ahead, for example, so keep in mind these two selected lines. So initially, the look-ahead will be this one and this one, neither of which are equal to the two processing codes. And we'll continue advancing until, let's see, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this side, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on that side. So at a certain point, what I have selected now would represent the two look-ahead pointers. And remember that we're comparing them to this for loop and then the closing brace up here. So on the left right now is what the left-hand processing pointer is pointing at, and on the right, after advancing 6 or so times, is what the right look-ahead pointer is looking at. And the right look-ahead pointer has now found a match, and it found a match before the left look-ahead pointer did. So at this point, we've identified the boundaries of this group here. And so that will then trigger within our while loop number 2, we'll have some other loop that briefly goes in and creates these 6 lines. And then we'll break out of loop number 2, and then the next time the parent loop runs, as part of this, we'll be advancing our right-hand processing pointer as we actually process the file. So eventually, by the time we break out of while loop number 2, all 4 pointers will be pointing at the content on their respective sides. We'll break out of while loop number 2, and at while loop number 1, we'll then return back to rule 1, which is looking for an exact match as is, and it will then trigger this condition and produce this line. So that's an example of how I see the logic working between while loop number 1 and while loop number 2. And then when while loop number 1 is done, so what does that mean? Well, that means basically we've reached the end of the shorter file. But the files might be of different length, and we're not dealing with any special logic. Like, we're not saying, well, the right file is always the short one or the left file is always the short one. And so now we have to have, after the while loop that we've produced, we have to have 2 more while loops, one each to check for whether its corresponding file still has data that needs to be completed or not. And so I've basically, just in the pseudocode here, I've combined these two while loops into one, but basically one of them will do this and one of them will do that. So it'll fill in the remaining lines for its corresponding file. So that's it for the pseudocode as I've thought about it so far. So let's talk about our 5 iterators real quick. Line iterator will advance each time a line is produced. That is the only condition, and it is absolute. Left processing pointer will advance each time a line is produced that uses left file content. Or it will advance in while loop number 2, that's this one, when both look-ahead pointers are completely exhausted. So if while loop number 2 doesn't get to the point where it actually performs any work, it will advance the processing pointers before we break out of it. So then the next time we hit while loop number 1, our processing pointers will have advanced and we will eventually break out of loop number 1 and not hit an infinite loop. And then also the processing pointer would be advanced. Actually, this isn't quite correct. It's not going to advance in both of these. It will advance in whichever one of these two while loops corresponds to the left-hand pointer. And then right processing pointer, same logic. Every time a line is produced with right file content, when we break out of while number 2, or in whichever one of these two while loops happens to correspond to the right-hand file. So I guess I should have been more clear on while loops 3 and 4, but we'll see in a future video. Pretty simple. So now for the look-ahead pointers. The left look-ahead pointer advances whenever the left processing pointer advances. We don't want the look-ahead to ever be less than the processing pointer. Or it advances in while loop number 2 when there is no line produced and there's still room for this pointer to advance. So we haven't reached the end of the left file in this example, but we also did not hit either of these conditions. Then we will advance that look-ahead pointer staying in while loop number 2. And look-ahead for right, same thing. Whenever the right processing pointer advances, we make sure that right look-ahead is not less than it. And when we're in while loop number 2 and we have not performed any actual work and there's still room for the pointer to advance, there's still things in that right-hand file to process, then we will advance it inside of while loop number 2. So I believe that covers the desired algorithm, general cases, and when we will iterate our pointers. So briefly, I want to go back. I'm going to move this to the other view, like that. Okay, so one thing that I want to look at is CSS. I think we'll do a little bit of coding and then we'll call this one good. So remember that I clarified class names, colors, and degree of subduedness. So maybe let's do a first pass on that. So I guess here I called this line.exact. So maybe just for clarity, I'll fix it over there. Okay, so now our pseudocode matches what we've done so far. I'm going to duplicate this line. Okay, and then let's do dot whitespace trim. And so that's going to be blue. So we'll put another 0 in there, remove a 0 from there. So now we have red, green, blue. And we do want that to be very subdued. So I think for now, I'm just going to keep the same 0.1 opacity here and 0.5 opacity there. We might tweak that a little bit in a future video. I'll duplicate that. So now we'll go here to removing all white space. So this is still going to be blue, but I want it to be less subdued. I'll just say 0.3, and I'm debating whether or not to subdue the color here. Let me think. No, I think I'm going to remove that. So yeah. Okay, so I think we're really just going to subdue the color when it is truly an exact match. And then for these, I guess we'll just have some subtle difference. Maybe I'll make it really subtle, and we'll tweak it later if we need to. And then for dot altered, so this is one that we want to draw attention to. So I want this to be maybe orange or something. So red will be 255. We'll have some green value and then probably 0 for blue. So I'll just make this about half. And then for color, I'll make that 0.5 because I want it to stand out. And then we also need dot only, and we might need dot empty if we don't have dot empty over here already. But importantly, when we're doing dot only, we need to include both the left and the right. So in the case of left, that's going to be red. So red is 255, green, blue. Okay, let me duplicate this. And then line right only will be green. And then I guess all we have left is dot empty, which will be black. So for that, let's duplicate the line. Dot empty. So the background color will be black 000, and we'll make sure that it's fairly subdued to start with, because we don't need to draw attention to an empty line. And so I think that's a good starting point. We've got most of our CSS defined and our class names defined, and I think in a future video, we'll actually continue working on the program flow, logic, structures, etc., based on what we talked about today in the pseudocode. Hopefully the project makes more sense, and in the next video, I'm hoping that we get enough done that we can really have a good demo. Just as a very quick reminder, I'll switch back over to this tab and I'll scroll up to the very top. So copying this in a general sense, as far as grouping ability, is the initial goal. And I'll bring up the browser here. This is a reminder of where the code currently gets us. So we can see that the first couple lines up to maybe this transition opacity 0.3, this is probably all one block, and then it's happening to match a couple of other specific lines. And if we look, sorry, wrong one. If we look here, yes. So basically we are correctly matching this first little bit, but we've not yet implemented the code to detect this. And of course, anything after this is going to be offset by varying amounts. So the likelihood of the lines matching decreases, which is why we just have a handful of lines after the first couple that happen to match here in the browser. Thank you for watching.